The room was quiet in the way hospice rooms often are late in the afternoon. The blinds were half closed, letting in a thin ribbon of golden light that rested gently across the blanket. The oxygen machine hummed in its steady rhythm. Somewhere down the hallway, a cartwheel squeaked and then faded away. I was sitting beside the bed, chart in my lap, not writing, just listening. She hadn't said much all day. Her breathing had grown softer over the past week, more spaced out, like her body was learning a new rhythm. Her hands rested loosely on top of the quilt her daughter had brought from home, pale blue fabric, tiny stitched flowers. I remember noticing how carefully it had been tucked around her shoulders. When I reached up to adjust her pillow, her eyes opened. Not wide, not startled, just present. There was a clarity in them that hadn't been there that morning, a kind of steadiness. She looked past me at first, toward the corner of the room where the light touched the wall. Then she shifted her gaze back to me, as if she had decided something. "Nurse," she said quietly, her voice thin but certain. "I need to tell you what's going to happen." It wasn't said with fear, and it wasn't said like a question. I pulled my chair a little closer. In hospice, when someone says they need to tell you something, you learn to slow down. You don't rush the moment. You don't fill the silence. You let it breathe. Her fingers moved slightly against the quilt, as if she were feeling something none of us could see. I waited. She began to speak about her family, not about memories, not about regrets, but about what was coming, about who would struggle, who would step up, who would surprise everyone. She spoke softly, almost thoughtfully, as if she had already seen it unfold. There was no confusion in her words, no wandering thoughts, just a quiet certainty. I've been at many bedsides. I know how the mind can drift near the end. I know how stories can blur into dreams. But this was different. The room felt still in a new way. Not heavy, not tense, just attentive, as though something important had entered the space, and only she could see it clearly. When she finished speaking, she didn't look tired. She looked relieved. And as I sat there beside her, listening to the oxygen hum and watching that last ribbon of sunlight fade from the blanket, I realized she hadn't been telling me a story. She had been preparing me for something her family didn't know was already on its way. The room was quiet, in the soft, late afternoon light that filtered through half-closed blinds, streaking the walls with a thin, warm gold. The hum of the oxygen machine was steady, familiar, almost like a heartbeat that had settled into its own rhythm, blending with the occasional creak of the sheets as she shifted slightly under the blanket. Her breathing was slow and measured, with tiny pauses that reminded me how fragile yet deliberate life could feel in this space. I had just pulled a chair closer to her bed, chart in hand, but mostly just watching, sitting quietly, letting the silence stretch without feeling the need to fill it. She was resting, her eyes closed, her hands folded loosely on top of the quilt her daughter had brought from home, a soft blue with small embroidered flowers. I noticed the way her fingers occasionally twitched, a subtle signal of thought or memory flickering through her mind. It was ordinary, this kind of movement. Yet in a hospice room, ordinary is often extraordinary when you slow down enough to really see it. The light touched the folds of her blanket and caught on the fine strands of hair at her temple. There was a softness to the space, an almost tangible stillness that invited listening. I reached forward gently to adjust her pillow, lifting it just slightly so it supported the curve of her neck. Her eyes opened, not wide, not startled, just present. She let them linger on me for a moment, and then, after a pause that felt like it contained more thought than words could hold, she spoke. "Nurse," she said quietly, her voice thin but certain. "I need to tell you about them." I didn't respond right away. In hospice, when someone begins to speak like this, you learn quickly that rushing is unnecessary. You allow the pause, let the room absorb the weight of what is coming, no matter how ordinary or extraordinary it might be. She moved her fingers against the quilt, almost like tracing invisible lines only she could see. Her gaze drifted toward the corner of the room where sunlight caught on the pale wall, and then back to me, steady and deliberate. "I've been thinking about my family," she continued, "about what they will face, what they might not see coming. I need someone to hear it, someone who will understand." Her words were not heavy or fearful. They were calm, reflective, and carried a quiet authority that made the room feel different, lighter in one way and heavier in another. She wasn't asking a question. She wasn't seeking reassurance. She was preparing, and somehow I felt that I had been invited into something sacred. I listened, letting her presence fill the space between us. Her breathing, the slow rise and fall of her chest, the faint rasp as she shifted, the slight hum of the machine, they all became part of the rhythm of our conversation, without a word needing to define it. I didn't interrupt. I simply watched her hands, the gentle flutter of her eyelids, the curve of her lips, as if she were tasting her own thoughts before speaking them aloud. "You know," she said after a pause, "sometimes people don't understand the small ways we leave pieces of ourselves behind. They think it's only memory or advice, but it's more than that. It's guidance, quiet guidance, that comes when they least expect it." Her eyes held mine for a moment, searching, as if confirming that I could see what she saw. I nodded slowly, and she allowed a faint smile to touch her lips before looking away again. The light had shifted slightly, lengthening across the floor, and for a moment, the room seemed suspended between one breath and the next. I noticed the slight lift of her shoulders as she shifted under the blanket, the way the thin blue quilt pooled softly around her arms. These ordinary gestures were more meaningful than any dramatic declaration could be. They were her presence insistently alive, even as her body moved closer to its limits. She continued, her voice low and steady. "There will be moments when they struggle, moments when they might falter or forget the strength they carry. And there will be times when they surprise themselves, when they rise in ways they didn't expect. I've seen it in them, even if they don't yet know it. And I want them to know, even if I'm not here to tell them directly." Her words didn't fill the room with tension or fear. They settled quietly like sunlight on the wall, warming without overwhelming. I found myself leaning in slightly, though I knew that leaning in was more for me than for her. She had all she needed in that moment. The clarity of her thoughts, the comfort of being understood, the presence of someone who would honor the gravity of what she was about to say without turning it into drama. We sat like that for some time. There was a rhythm to it, a cadence of silence and sound that felt intimate and deliberate. Her breathing, the occasional sigh, the whisper of her words, all created a tapestry of presence that was easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. But I was paying attention. I always pay attention. In this work, small L details are often more truthful than sweeping statements. "I think," she said softly, after another pause, "that part of what I leave behind isn't what people think. It's not just memories or advice. It's the moments they can't see, the quiet choices, the tiny shifts in how they care for one another, the empathy that grows from one small act. That is where my guidance lives." Her hands flexed slightly against the quilt. I noticed how her fingers caught the light, how her knuckles were slightly more pronounced now, how her nails bore the faintest trace of a pale polish. These details didn't matter in a conventional sense, but in the stillness of the room, they became part of the story she was sharing without words. "I want them to know," she continued, "that even when I'm gone, they will have the strength to carry on. They might not recognize it at first. They might think the weight is too much, but it isn't. They have it inside them already. I can see it." She paused, letting the words hang in the quiet space between us. I felt the room respond, not in sound, not in movement, but in the way air seems to settle when something significant passes through it. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but you could feel it if you allowed yourself to notice. I allowed myself to notice. Her gaze shifted to the window for a moment, watching the light catch on the faint pattern of the blinds. Then she looked back, her eyes soft but unwavering. "I need you to understand this," she said, not as a warning, not as a lesson, but as a gift, in the way that only quiet observation can give. "You will see what I mean, someday." I nodded again, silently affirming that I understood, or at least that I would try. She smiled faintly, a small curve of her lips that carried a sense of relief. Not relief from illness, not relief from fear, but relief in having shared something meaningful, something that had waited patiently for this moment to be voiced. The oxygen machine hummed steadily. The sheets shifted once more as she adjusted her position, and the light continued to drift slowly across the room, unnoticed by anyone but us. Her presence was calm, grounded, and profoundly human. There was no drama, no theatrical gesture. There was only the quiet certainty of someone who had looked closely at life, at the family she loved, and had decided to leave them a piece of herself in the only way she could. We remained like that, quietly companionable, the pauses between words, as important as the words themselves. In those pauses, I noticed the smallest details. The way her breath deepened slightly when she settled back, the faint crease at the corner of her mouth, the soft sigh that accompanied a shift of her shoulders. All of these ordinary things became extraordinary under the lens of attentiveness. They were proof that life and care and love persist even as the body changes, even as the end approaches. "I think," she whispered, "that the moments that matter most aren't the ones you remember in detail. They are the ones you feel, without knowing why, the ones that shape who you become quietly, without fanfare or announcement." Her eyes closed briefly, then opened again, as if confirming she had said what she needed to say. She didn't seem tired. She seemed resolved. There was a patience in her gaze, an understanding that whatever unfolded afterward, she had done what she could. She had shared what she needed to share. And in that sharing, she had created a space where something sacred could exist without explanation, without rush, without judgment. I watched her hands one last time as they rested on the quilt. The pale blue fabric, the tiny flowers, the faint lift of her fingers as she adjusted to settle more comfortably, it all seemed deliberate. A slow and quiet choreography that mirrored the careful precision of her words. Every motion, every pause, every breath carried meaning if you looked closely enough. And then she said, almost to herself, "They will know, they will understand in their own time." I stayed with her in that quiet room, listening to the hum, feeling the light, noticing the subtle shifts in posture, the gentle exhalations, the tiny signals of thought that passed like whispers over her hands. There was no urgency, no drama, only presence, only care, only the quiet unfolding of something meaningful that could not yet be seen, only felt. And as I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the silence expand, I realized that what she had given me was more than a story, more than a reflection. It was a presence. It was a map of future tenderness, a guide to the unseen strength her family would carry forward, quietly, slowly, without even knowing it had come from her. And in that moment, sitting beside her, listening to the soft rise and fall of her chest, the faint hum of the machine, and the almost imperceptible shift of sunlight across the quilt, I understood that some truths are felt before they are known, and I knew, quietly, that what she had told me would stay with me long after the light had faded.